Church Rosemary, and a particular mention and warm welcome to His Grace Bishop Elianos of Melody, who is joining us this evening. This evening is a combined Central Youth event, and we're very glad to have from above, so that we may bring to a good end in a way pleasing to you the evening which we are conducting in your name today, for the service of your people and the salvation of our souls. For it is you who causes us both to will and to act for your good will, and to give you all the glory and thanks with your only begotten Son and Holy Spirit forever. Amen. Please be seated. And I'll hand over to Vanessa Papastavros, who is one of the coordinators of the Central Youth Committee. And for those who are watching us live, please sign up to all the different social media accounts. Central Youth Committee is one of them, and then each church has its own youth group and youth fellowship. In our case, it's St. George Fellowship at Rose Bay.
Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Father, for leading us in prayer and also for the plug. And I'll just quickly explain for anyone who might not be familiar what the Central Youth Committee is. We're not a fellowship in itself, we're actually a body that sort of brings together all the different youth fellowships, whether they're university fellowships or they're from individual parishes, to try and have inter-parish events so that people from all over New South Wales can connect with one another and under the banner of our faith. And today, the reason we are commemorating the great martyr Saint Marina, of course, just in herself, her significance, her story alone would be a cause for such an event, but also she is the patron saint of the CYC. Because of her young years that she martyred at the age of about 15. So she's a very inspiring figure for youth and young adults, and hopefully today, while we discuss her life and the lessons that we can take away from her life, you'll be inspired by her as well. If at any stage you have questions, just raise your hand and interrupt me, and hopefully I'll be asking a few questions as well, and that will stimulate a bit of discussion. I would certainly love to hear from you and your thoughts. And I don't consider myself at all an expert on this topic, so should I not be able to answer the question, hopefully there will be someone here who can shed some light as well. So to begin, I want to quickly discuss the life of Saint Marina. Some of you may be familiar with her life, but for those of you who aren't, I thought I'd do a very brief biography of what exactly happened and why it is she's known as a great martyr in our faith. So Marina was born in the early 4th century in Antioch, and her father was a pagan priest and her mother died in childbirth. Marina was left to the care of a nursemaid who was a Christian, and this was her first interaction with Christianity, was through this woman who cared for her in the role of a mother. And it was as a teenager that she then decided to dedicate her life to Christ, and she took a vow of chastity to God, so that she chose then to never marry. When we put that in the context of her life, she is the daughter of a pagan priest, and someone who was quite significant in that society, and she learned about the faith through someone who was in a very humble role. A person who was just basically there to be her carer. I think that in itself is a really interesting point to take away from her life, that any of us can lead in a way that her nursemaid did to Christ, another person who wouldn't have found out or understood anything about Christianity if it weren't for that. So she discovers Christ and she decides to commit herself to Christ in a situation where everything about that decision incites hostilities. And one day when Marina was tending sheep, a Roman prefect named Olympius saw her and decided that he wanted to marry her. And when she refused, she was denounced as a Christian. And this is not an uncommon thing actually in the stories of the early martyrs. It was often the case that where a woman would choose to vow her life to Christ that she would never marry. She would in fact be persecuted significantly for this by those who were pagans, and it almost became a challenge. You know, it was the insult not just of I'm not going to marry you, but the reason being because of a God that these people, you know, didn't believe in and considered insignificant. So, as a result of that choice, upon refusing to sacrifice to the pagan god, she was subjected to various tortures by Liberius, including being beaten with clubs and skin being raped in iron combs. And when we consider that she was only 12 years old when she decided to dedicate her life to Christ, she was incredibly young and no support network. It took a great deal of faith to stand up to a Roman official, not a Roman official, but stand up for an official at that time, and to subject herself to so much pain and torture for a God that she hadn't even been baptized into the faith of yet. So when we really consider her life in that context, it's quite remarkable that she had such strong faith at such a young age. So while she was imprisoned, the devil tried to frighten her 3 times, and according to our tradition, we were told that the first time he appeared as a dragon, and he attempted to devour her, and she made the sign of the cross, and the beast was torn apart and vanished. And twice more he appeared to her as a man, and in the first instance she seized his hair and beat him with a hammer, and in the second instance she whipped him, and after these events he disappeared, and all the physical injuries were healed. And again, I think it's significant that the devil appeared to her 3 times. At one point, and this to me is sort of the climax of her story, at one point Olympus ordered that Marina be drowned in a large cauldron of boiling water, some accounts say. And before this happened, she cried out to the Lord and asked that he transform this torture into her baptism. And she plunged herself into the water 3 times. And upon doing so, a white dove descended from heaven, and the chains that bound her fell off her body. And everyone who witnessed that miracle, and there were many thousands who did, became Christians as a result, because they were so amazed, as anyone would be. Sometimes we hear stories of these miracles and they seem unfathomable or very difficult for us to imagine, but it would be very hard to witness that and not convert to the faith, I think. But I always find it incredible that in the moment that was supposed to be her death, a really horrifying torture, was in fact the moment that she was sanctified and baptized. And I think it was shortly after this that she was beheaded at the age of about 15, around 304 AD. And many other Christians also martyred shortly after with her as a result. But of course we know that it is not what happens in this life that really counts, it's what happens in the next. So for those many Christians who lost their lives, they saved their souls and they walked Christ among them. But I think when we consider that life, it's quite an extraordinary life. When we consider who Saint Marina was, at her young age, the fact that she shows such boldness in her faith and such firmness, it's something that many of us will envy, especially at this age, where oftentimes we feel we're being buffeted by our doubts or by the temptations or the difficulties and struggles of the world. So I think we can turn to her as a source of great inspiration. For this particular talk, while there's many different things we can take away from her life, I wanted to focus on the fact that Saint Marina has earned the title of Demon Slayer, the vanquisher of demons. It's a very cool title, I always found. I think when I first heard it, I thought, wow, she's a really tough saint. I think when I considered the story of her life, oftentimes we can forget the fact that she, through God's grace, conquered the devil 3 times in a very physical manifestation of the devil. But it's what she's still known as today. She's a patron saint of demon exorcism, or she vanquishes demons to this day. And I think that's something that we can explore in our context in a really practical way, that as young people we ourselves can take away an important message from her story. So before we move on, I thought I'd just preemptively touch on what I mean by demons. I don't think any of us, I can't speak for anyone here in fact, but I myself have not been devoured by a dragon or confronted the devil in physical form, although we hear stories of this often in church, and also people that we know have had experiences that can't be explained away. But in the perspective of the Orthodox Church, demons and demon possession isn't what it looks like in a horror film or, in a book, where we have these really dramatic visions of what demonic possession looks like. That sort of violent and horrific imagery of exorcisms and that we often see in the media can actually make demons seem very far removed from us, something that's very fantastical or comical. And in truth, the devil and the demons are a lot more cunning than that. They are very subtle operators, and they like to work in secret so that they can influence us. They scout us out, they figure out what our weaknesses are, what the chinks in our armour are, and then they offer the temptations that they know will work on us. And all that is required of us is to slowly make small decisions that turn us away from God, so that gradually over time, if that pattern continues, the demons will have more and more of an influence over us, including our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So oftentimes when we, as Orthodox Christians, think about demons, we're not thinking about them in this sort of scary, horrific vision. We're thinking about, in a way, our thoughts and our actions can be influenced by evil intentions. And that isn't to say that demons can't be physically manifested, of course they are. But it's less common, I suppose, in most people's experiences, and I would actually say that it would be a great danger to think that that is the only way the devil will present himself in your life. I think it's more likely, especially in an age where we're increasingly living in a secular world, that the devil will use those means to appeal to us and to tempt us. So now that we've finished that preamble, I wanted to begin by looking at Saint Marina's story and the way she conquered or vanquished the demons in her life. Yes, I found this reading my mind. Thank you so much. So the first step that we need to take, especially when we reflect on Saint Marina's life, is that we ourselves need to know and name our demons. In the story of Luke, chapter 8, verses 26 to 39, Jesus casts out the demons of a man who lives alone among the tombs, and many of us will be familiar with this story. And he sends the demons into a herd of pigs. And in the account, Jesus asks the demons, possessing the man, "What is your name?" And we hear the man say, "Legion," because many demons have entered him. And this is an important moment, because often we overlook that element of the story when we read that particular passage of the Bible. There are a few reasons why we need to name our demons. The first is that it is the beginning of the healing process towards reconciliation with God. It is how we begin to exorcise or cast out the demons. We need to acknowledge their presence. And the second reason is that demons often possess us in that they take over our identity or our sense of self. So for instance, someone who has, these are examples that I'm plucking off the top of my head, but for someone who has, for instance, an eating disorder or mental illness or depression, they might say that they don't know who they are without their illness. That's a really common thing. And someone who is, for instance, a workaholic and can't tear themselves away from their work, they might identify so strongly with that particular pattern of behaviour that it becomes their whole identity. Or if someone has spiraled into a culture of binge drinking every weekend and partying hard, they might identify those passions as being their personality traits. And those are the things that we confront as youth and as young adults on a pretty regular basis. And they're all things that, if we really reflect on our own behaviours, I'm sure we could find particular negative habits or passions that we probably think, that's my personality. In truth, that is the reason why we need to name these demons, because we need to understand that they're actually something external to ourselves. They aren't us. We need to know that they are our temptations. So the more we come to know God, the more that we purge ourselves of these passions, the more our true self is revealed. And that self comes into focus. It's the version of us that is being restored by God's grace. And it's a version of us that is not beholden to anything or anyone in this life, but lives in true light and freedom. Are we all following me? Cool. If you're not, just let me know. The demons in our life are anything that tries to distract us or turn us away from God. And that can literally be anything. It doesn't have to be anything so obviously negative. It can be something that could be quite positive. It could even be a relationship with another person. So I think what is admirable about Saint Marina and her story is that she really knew the demons that were confronting her. And she was so willing to confront them. Her boldness is the characteristic that I most admire about her in her story. So let's begin by identifying some of the demons that Saint Marina experienced in her life. Does anyone want to call out if they're bold enough themselves? A few of the examples, even the more obvious examples in the story of how the demons presented themselves. Yeah. As a dragon, good. Dragon.
Denying Christ?
Yes, denying Christ. So the temptation to sacrifice to the idols and deny Christ was an obviously really big one because it would mean all the tortures would end. I would add as well that obviously the prefect who was torturing her, Olybrius, her father's behaviour towards her, the fact that he went on to disown her and obviously did not really care whether she was going to be killed or not, which is quite disturbing. And of course, the supposed many temptations that she faced. You mentioned the fact that she could have denied Christ. I would say also the fact she was offered marriage as a way out. She would have been married to a very significant person and she would have been gaining social status, she would have had wealth, she would have been very secure in her society as a woman who would otherwise, due to her context and the time she was living in, have no security, and especially as a woman who had vowed chastity and to live as a Christian. So there were a lot of different things that tempted her, and she could have very easily chosen, especially as a 15-year-old girl, to pursue in order to save herself from the torture that was ahead of her. And the reason I think it's important that we pause to identify these demons in her story, but also in our stories, is that if we cannot identify them and we cannot know them, they will control us without us ever being aware that they are controlling us. So I'll provide another example. Sometimes if a person is abused at a very young age, in order to protect themselves, they actually won't remember that abuse. They will bury it deep down, and they won't be able to record memory. And while that is a very common coping mechanism, unfortunately, as they grow older, that pattern of behaviour will still, the emotional pain or trauma will come out in other relationships with people. So even if they can't remember what happened, the imprint or the stain or the trauma is still there, and it affects how they live their lives. And the only way that they can stop that self-destructive pattern of behaviour is if they actually confront the memory or the experience that is very deep, deep down. And it takes a huge amount of courage to do that, to look within ourselves and find what it is that's happened to us. But if they feel safe and secure enough to do it, by naming that experience, and in some instances, or in this particular example, naming the person who perpetrated that particular abuse, it's like raising that young child that died inside of them from the dead, so that they can then live as an adult person. And that inner child is integrated with themselves as an adult. And in this case, of that particular example, the demon entered through the abusive actions of another person. And hopefully none of us have had that experience in our lives, but even so, all of us have had experiences in our lives that are traumatic or destructive. Everyone. No one can avoid that. Even if you want to live under in a common law, all of us are going to experience some kind of trauma in our lives because that's just the experience of living in a fallen world. People will disappoint you, people you love will leave or die. It's unavoidable, even if we try to have the most perfect life. Sometimes it can be the result of external actions, but sometimes it's the result of our own actions that we experience these things. And either way, we're still going through trauma, and we all have demons that we need to confront. And if we didn't, then we wouldn't have passions. Our passions give the devil a foothold into our lives. So if you think about your heart as something that is, it's like a garden that we need to protect and nurture so it can grow. And you build a bit of a fence around it so that you can avoid things getting in and messing with that garden, ripping things up or eating things. Essentially, our passions give the devil a foothold over that fence so that he can climb over it and get in and reap whatever havoc he wants. So we need to start by naming our demons so we can build up our defenses. So I would encourage you following tonight to take some time out of your busy schedules and reflect on whatever you're identifying as being a major demon in your life right now. Something that's really weighing you down. It might be an experience or the actions of a person in our life who's led us astray or caused us pain. Maybe it's your own addictions or your own desires to chase empty things in this world. And our passions, whatever they might be, greed, lust, arrogance, anger, fear, pride, despair, the list goes on. Those are the demons that we are facing daily in our struggle as Christians. So what lessons can we learn from Saint Marina to teach us how to overcome those demons? Thank you. The first is to have courage. Saint Marina's story is remarkable because of her great courage for one who is so young. And what would you say were some of the moments of great boldness and courage in her life? Any takers?
When she refused to be married to, was it the Roman?
Yes, she refused to be married to a Roman prefect. Absolutely. I think that in itself took guts when we consider that she was a very young woman. Her sort of political standing was not great because she'd been disowned for being a Christian. And to be a woman in that time was to be completely without any sort of power, unless you were someone of great nobility or royalty. You essentially had no choice. So I think to refuse marriage from someone who was very powerful took a huge amount of courage. Anything else?
Her faith?
Yeah, her faith. Especially in the face of a father who was a pagan priest. What drama that was, of course, in the household. And also, moreover, the fact that her faith in so many tortures. And she was healed after these tortures. We know that angels appeared to her, God healed her, but she still had to go through them again and again. And I think her strength in going through them and not succumbing to them is incredible. When we put it in context that her father had disowned her, that she was a follower of Christ without any community around her to support her, her nursemaid eventually left, so she didn't, once she was old enough to no longer need someone to care for her. She was completely alone. And we could probably all imagine how that felt. Right, we ourselves do have a community around us, and we're very fortunate to look around and see all the people that are in this room that can connect with us over our faith, that hopefully we have families who can support our faith or understand what we're going through. I'm still sure that many of us as young people can relate to that experience of isolation and just how easily that feeling can bury you. So we need to remember, and this is a Nelson Mandela quote, but I thought I would throw it in because it was so fitting. We need to remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I think that perfectly captures her life story. Of course we're going to feel afraid, and we'll be fools if, as we go through our lives and confront our struggles, and especially confront ourselves, we'll be fools to be fearless. That's the way a foolish person would act. Of course you will feel fear, but the true test of our characters and of our faith is our ability to rise above our fear. What I would say is often if we are having trouble figuring out what our demons are or what it is in our lives that are tempting us or keeping us trapped, then I would ask yourself, or at least I would start with the question, what do I fear the most? And the reason I would begin in that way is that oftentimes our fears are what's trapping us in not changing and not transforming, and what causes resistance between us and God. So perhaps it is a fear of being worthless or powerless, or a fear of being abandoned or unloved, a fear of being rejected by your peers, a fear of poverty, a fear of failure. The list could go on, but often our fears point to what we need to confront within ourselves. And fear can be a particularly useful demonic influence to the devil because it keeps us in stasis and we stop moving and it stunts our growth. So we need to have courage to confront ourselves and confront our demons, and it's a very uncomfortable experience to do that. And unless we have the ability to sit in that discomfort, we will never be able to embrace the feeling that God will bring us, which is of course now the next step. So, first up, we name the demons. And as we said earlier, when we do name our demons, it's the start of healing. And this is something that is integrated into the very sacraments of our church. And this is the entire purpose of the sacrament of confession. Confessing to God our sins is literally what I mean by naming the demons in our lives, naming the things that are the sins of the passions that are keeping us trapped or weighing us down. Confessing our passions, our weaknesses, and our sinful inclinations is that process. So even at times, you may need to name the people who are serving to bring those particular temptations and sins into your life, and that isn't to judge them at all. Of course, you don't bring confession to list other people's sins or failures because that would defeat your purpose in there. But sometimes you also need to name who these people are because they may actually be a really negative influence on your life. And if you're unwilling to acknowledge that, you can be driven to some very dark places as a result. So I think you have to be very honest with yourself in that process. Because unless you acknowledge that person's role, it is somebody, it could be someone you're in a relationship with, it could be a family member, it could be a work colleague, it could be someone at school. But unless you're willing to acknowledge that role, you'll never be able to cease the influence that they didn't have on you. You have to be able to give that to God. Otherwise, you can't carry it on your own. So even though others may have brought those demons into your life, it's your responsibility to cast them out. You have to be the one to give them to Christ. You can't point to another person and say, oh, they made me, or it's their fault, or because of their own experience in this. At the end of the day, we have to take responsibility of ourselves and our souls, and we need to be able to come to confession, really truthfully seeing ourselves, and hopefully God will grant us the humility to do that because we can only experience that through His grace. So when we think about the sacrament of confession, our spiritual Father knows how to help us. At times we can probably identify that the footprint or the fingerprint of a demon in our lives, and also when we can, He can identify the way that temptations work in our lives, and He knows how to help us overcome those passions or weaknesses. So for those of us who may be unwilling to name our demons, or who may feel a resistance to the idea of going to confession, at the very least, I suggest walking away from tonight asking yourself why you feel that way, what it is that's holding you back, what makes you resist, what is essentially the gateway to healing and reconciliation. Confronting our demons is a process that requires patience, perseverance, and above everything else, God's mercy. I put another quote up here. It is not, again, it's not the quote in the saint, which is very uncharacteristic of me, but I just thought it was so perfect. It's from a famous playwright, and it says, "Confront the dark parts of yourself and work to banish them with illumination and forgiveness. Your willingness to wrestle with your demons will cause your angels to sing. Use the pain as fuel, as a reminder of your strength. When I came across that quote a while ago, I thought that really hit home about Saint Marina's story. That expression of when you wrestle with your demons, it will cause your angels to sing. And we see that in her story. Each time she literally wrestles with the devil. We're told she pulls his hair and brings a hammer down on him, she whips him. So we're getting a sense that she physically wrestled with the devil. The angels then attended her. After those very dramatic scenes, the angels then came to her and healed her. And it's the same way in our lives. If anyone's ever had an experience of really confronting something in your life that is horrible, traumatic, something that's a deep weakness in yourself, and really wrestling with that experience and trying to uproot that passion, it's very hard going through it, particularly mentally and spiritually. But afterwards, you do feel that rush of grace, and you do feel as if your guardian angel is like right there next to you, tapping you on the shoulder, being like, you did it. Like, round one, ding, you get the points. It's a great feeling, and oftentimes we avoid the wrestling with those demons. A lot of people live their lives in a sense of complacency because they're afraid of the exertion of that experience of wrestling with themselves. But in reality, the wonderful experience of God's grace, even if you feel you failed, even if you feel like you failed that round, if this is like a wrestling match, like the angels are still there, they've got a towel, throw on your shoulder, they're slapping around, send you back in. You go again, and you just keep going. Like that's an incredible way of living life. And I think it's also the way Saint Marina lived her life, because she didn't confront the devil once or twice, she confronted him 3 times. And I think the reality is it was her strength, and it came from illumination and forgiveness. It was her strength that allowed her to wrestle with the demons the way she did. So there will be struggle involved in confronting our demons, whatever they look like for us, and it will require us to change as people. But that struggle is our ability to surrender the fight to God so that He can fight for us, with us, and heal us. Jesus explains in Luke 11, verses 24 to 27, when an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to the house I left. When it arrives, it finds the house swept and clean and put in order. Then it goes and takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there, and the final condition of that person is worse than the first. So I think this is a really important warning to all of us as we go through this process. Firstly, we need to be patient with ourselves when we undergo this experience of wrestling with our demons, of confronting ourselves, of coming to confession, of being humiliated and humbled. Because it's a lifelong process. It's not you do it once and you're fine. It's the rest of your life as a Christian. It is the struggle towards salvation. If we try to become saints overnight, we're setting ourselves up for a really, really high fall. We need to remember our progress is not always linear, and that things don't happen instantaneously. Marina did not confront that devil once, we said 3 times. So it's no surprise that, also I think it's very significant that number 3 is an incredibly important number in the Gospel, and that Christ himself, it was 3 days before he was resurrected. But it's a reminder that Christ, who took those 3 days to trample down death, things happen slowly. Transformation isn't instant. And in the same way, in Saint Marina's story, her transformation wasn't instant either. It was a very gradual thing, and it was quite an incredible thing because she went through so many tortures, but it was by no means a very quick thing. So when we confront our demons, we have to take action. There needs to be consequences. It's not just enough to confess them and name them. We then require change. Otherwise, we leave an empty space behind, and that will be filled up with even more sin and even more peril. So if we're going to confront ourselves, and this is the danger, I guess, in undertaking this journey without Christ's grace and humility at the centre. if we were to confront ourselves and sort of go on this journey of, spiritual awakening and mindfulness and new age kind of ideas, yes, we might purge those initial issues or sins or addictions or passions, whatever they might be, but we're very likely to fall even harder into greater sins afterwards, because you yourself have gradually built up your ability to rely on God and also to develop self-discipline. It's kind of like crash dieting in a way. Like you think, oh, if I just don't eat for a couple of weeks, I'll lose the weight, and then you put twice as much of the weight on, because your body isn't supposed to be restricted that way. It's actually terrible for you. It would be better for you to lose the weight gradually over many, many years than to try and force your body into such a traumatic experience. And it's very similar with the way we treat our souls. It should be gradual. It doesn't matter if we're not perfect overnight. It needs to be something we're very gentle and tender with. So this may require us to set boundaries in our relationships, particularly if they're relationships where even the people we love dearly, perhaps they might still bring about or trigger particular temptations or patterns in our lives. Doesn't mean cut the person out of your life. It just might mean setting up boundaries for yourself, and that requires you to know yourself. Perhaps it also means setting up boundaries for yourself with other things, where you might have patterns or behaviours of thought that can lead you astray, and that again is where your spiritual father comes in to guide you. But that process of turning inward and confronting our demons is the one that must be led by prayer, forgiveness and grace. Otherwise, it will just leave an empty space for the devil to fill again. We need the help of a trusted spiritual father. We need the help of friends or family who understand the faith, because you can't go through it alone. And even Saint Marina had her angels. She knew she wasn't alone. Otherwise, if we try to do this on our own, if we try to wrestle demons by ourselves, and they will very likely beat us on our own merits, in fact they most definitely will, we will just become bitter and depressed or fall into even greater passions after that, and we will feel overwhelmed and powerless. And that is in fact the devil's greatest trick to pull on you. Because once you feel that way, that's when you lose your salvation, that's when you turn away. It is better that you struggle and fail than be so overwhelmed you stop struggling. God's grace changes the experience for us, and when we confront our demons and when we name them, we reclaim power back. And that's the beauty of God's grace, is that even if we are defeated, that's in fact where we're crowned. That's why Saint Marina, her final beheading wasn't as terrible as, the Roman critic thought it was. For her, it was a crowning, and she got everything she really truly desired, which was to be with Christ. And I think that the crowning moment of Saint Marina's story is actually the moment of her baptism. And often we say that our saints, particularly the martyrs of the early church, in a sense, she was baptized in blood, she was martyred for the faith, but it's such a subversive moment. Like, if you can just imagine everyone's faces, they thought they had won, they had conquered her, we're going to kill this girl, and all our troubles would go. Because obviously she's developing a bit of following, and people are starting to take notice of the fact we can't seem to kill her. So we'll drown her, and that will be the end of it. And not only does she survive that, she's baptized in that moment, and God, through His grace, transforms that water into that cauldron into her baptismal font. And think about the experience of all those people witnessing that and seeing that dove descend. Firstly, again, I think she's pretty gutsy, like for her to basically dunk herself 3 times and cry on God. I mean, the faith to be able to do that He might use that moment for her salvation. But even beyond that, I think it shows the extreme magnitude of love God has for us when, during that struggle, we surrender to Him. And we don't try to fight it by ourselves. If she would have tried to have fought it by herself in that moment, she would have perished, without a doubt. It was because she turned to Christ that He was able to save her and heal her. And like the 3 youths in the fire that we read of in the Old Testament, she survived. So I want to end, before we go into questions, and I hope everything I've said, people have followed up until this point, and that it is correct. But I wanted to end on a sort of final note that hopefully will give everyone some hope to take away with. Again, it's not a saint's quote, but another really, really good one that I just thought fit. So we're borrowing, as St. Basil tells us to, B. If I got rid of my demons, I would lose my angels. This quote I came across a very long time ago, and it's kind of stuck with me as someone who wrestles with a lot of demons, or at least I think we all do, and I'm very aware of them. And the reason I thought this quote captured what I wanted to conclude with is because, again, it parallels so wonderfully with Saint Marina's story. God allows everything in our lives for our high purpose and our salvation. And as long as we don't resist that process, His grace can transform our demons into instruments of our salvation. That's the real, that must feel like a knife to the devil. Imagine throwing everything you can to try and conquer someone's soul, and because that person turns to Christ, those things that were supposed to destroy them, in fact, are almost like signposts to their salvation. It's an incredible thing that I think that's truly how Christ conquers death and sin, is that He can use those things in our lives to still bring us light. We see this in Saint Marina's story, and we see it in the story of so many saints, and we may even see it in the story of our loved ones and ourselves in our lives. For many people, we'll be battling with our demons until the day we die. And sometimes it is just a miracle when a person sees themselves, the destruction that they're doing to themselves, and repents. That is a miracle sometimes. I've witnessed that in my life with people and thought, I never thought that would come. I never thought that they would experience that humility, that they can see. And it's an incredible moment. And I'm sure many of us experience that ourselves, but there's something miraculous about witnessing it in a person we love in your life and thinking, wow, they've had a moment of salvation. But that doesn't mean that person will suddenly be perfect. As we said, it's not an instantaneous transformation. It is likely they will fall again, or they'll fall into the same sin again, and they'll have to struggle again, and we'll be in the same battle again, and over and over. That isn't something we should feel despair over. We should remember that in those moments where we're wrestling with our demons, it causes our angels to sin. And maybe that's the reason why God is allowing those demons to be there. There's a story that St. Papastavros tells, and most of you might be familiar with it, but I thought it would complement this theme nicely, where there was an alcoholic monk who was causing a great deal of scandal in one of the monastic communities at Mount Athos. And when he died, some of the faithful were relieved that this problem had finally been solved, and they went to tell Elder Papastavros. And he said that he already knew about the monk's death because he had seen a battalion of angels come to collect his soul. And others were scandalized by this. They're like, does he know who died? Was he getting confused with someone else? But Elder Papastavros explained that monk had been born in Asia Minor when the Turks would round up all the boys, and to keep him quiet at night so that he would not be reaped by the soldiers, his parents used to put raki in his milk. And so as a result, he grew up struggling with alcoholism the rest of his life. And when he came to the monastery, he would work daily on his struggle with drinking, and his spiritual father would say, even if it's just 1 cup less, just focus on that. And so over the years, while he was still struggling with his alcohol addiction, he was able to work on it slowly, so that over time he reduced the amount he would drink. He was never sober. He was never perfect. He never met that sort of goal. But he struggled to the very end of his life, and he was rewarded for that struggle. The world saw an alcoholic monk, but God saw him as a man who fought a long struggle to reduce his passion. And that's why the angels came. And I say this story because we should not judge those who cannot conquer their passions completely. Saint Marina's life is an inspiration, but not all of us will live as incredibly think we had struggle, bold, courageous, strong. Not all of us will live that way. Some of us will struggle, and that's okay, because there is enough grace for us in that struggle. There is a crown if we conquer our demons, and there is grace if we fall short, as long as we continue to struggle. So I say this so that we do not judge others, but also so that we do not judge ourselves, and that we give ourselves the same compassion that we would give other people if they are struggling. God allows the demons to come so the angels can to attend to us, and He allows them so that we can persevere and improve our faith. So I hope that this talk gave everyone some food for thought. I hope that Saint Marina can inspire you in your own life. There are so many things you can take away from her life. I focus on one facet. So I hope that you, at the very least, you go away and read about her story and continue to commemorate her as a saint, not just today, but in the way that you as a young person live out your life and the way that you live out your struggles. I'll open up to questions. I don't have no authority on this, so if there are questions that I cannot answer, I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts. I'd love to hear Father and Miss Grace's thoughts if they have any answers, or anyone else's thoughts, but I thought it would be good for us to finish with a little bit of discussion if we have the time. Thank you.
Question back there.
Is there a question? Yes. You want to stand? I think this mic's working now, so you can shut off. Oh my God, thank you. So organised. Oh, Father, I'm very impressed. Far more organised than I am. All right, thanks.
Yes, I was thinking about Saint Marina and how extraordinary her life was. And then I also thought, Christianity was, what time was she in, like 300 or something?
Yeah, she martyred in 304 AD.
Okay. But there would have been a fair number of Christians, and there would have been quite a lot of people who dedicated themselves to Christ. But we only hear of the ones that were victorious, because that's what's at stake. So I'm saying that there would have been others that would have also come against what and lost, and they disappeared and they didn't become things like that. It was strange, it just came to my thought, because if we do have a fight, we have to try our best, because otherwise you vanish and make really good things. And of course that you can fall back, but I just thought that was an interesting thought that came to my mind. What's your opinion?
No, that was a stimulating discussion, which I'm not for. I could talk underwater, so that's not really a problem. It's a great point to raise, because obviously at the time there were underground Christian communities, and I think for Saint Marina, from what I've read, is that the reason she was so isolated is because of who her parents were, and the only real person who instructed her in the faith was a nursemaid, who eventually had to leave the household. So I think, and also, she as a result of her martyrdom, people converted. So we know that there were obviously people who were following in the faith. And like you said, Max, the stories that we remember are the ones from that time period of the saints who lived incredible lives and died in their incredible ways for their faith. So there absolutely would have been other Christians at the time. And I would probably argue that in that particular area, it would be unlikely to find any Christians who were lukewarm, as we might describe it, only because they were so persecuted. It sort of drives people to extremes. So you can give up your faith and convert so that you can live freely, or you would have to defend the faith and probably live underground or martyr. It's an interesting thought. But in saying that as well, I think it's something we can take away an example from. We ourselves in our current time are very fortunate in Australia that we do not live in a society where we are under extreme persecution the way that the early church was. And we're very lucky. There might be times where people will throw up their arms and say we're being persecuted, but realistically in Australia we should be counting our blessings and feel great gratitude. That isn't to say that we don't experience struggles as a result of being Christian. Of course we do. Every Christian we're told that we're going to. We're told the world will hate us for being Christians, so we accept it. But we don't have to give our lives for our faith in Australia, the way that Christians do in other countries even today. So I think it's a little bit sobering, but also perhaps it gives us a bit of courage in our daily lives, in the struggles we're facing, to think if people are willing to live their life for this, and God is not testing me in that way, He's not allowed that to come past me in my context, perhaps I need to view whatever struggle I'm experiencing with a bit of gratitude, because it's giving me an opportunity to persevere and to grow. But yeah, it was a very different time in that period. I mean, I can't imagine that kind of persecution. I know that it still happens, but Christianity in particular is a very persecuted religion, but yeah, I can't even imagine it. Any other questions or thoughts? Or anyone who would like to add to that?
You talked about elder Theseus' that story that I'm coming from, and you said he never was sober, he never reached perfection, but he's had this legion of angels that carry the soul away. Does that mean that, in your opinion, would you say that we strive, or our expectations are perfection, and so that's why we find it harder when we see that we have passions, or we're uncomfortable with when the passions are revealed to us? Would you say that it's because we expect ourselves to be a certain level and we're not, and then we want a quick fix because we can't see that process, like we can't see ourselves dying and being saved without being perfect, because we expect it from us and not from us?
Yes, I will speak from experience here. I can safely say, up until this stage of my life, my perfectionism is the worst and most dangerous sin I commit on a regular basis. Perfectionism is basically denying the grace of God and holding yourself as the higher judge. And if you're someone who's prone to thinking that way, and I think a lot of us are, it is the height of pride. And I think the reason, some people will click with this stuff more easily. Some people are so, God's grace just dwells on them, and even being in their presence, you feel their wholeness. And that isn't to say that we struggle to get there, but we also read accounts of saints who, from birth, people would pick that about them and say that it's like they were like that from a child. And for others, there's the struggle. All of us are different, but I think the difference being that those saints who are holy in that way never ever even try to perceive themselves as being perfect. That isn't to say we don't aim for some degree of perfection, or we don't aim to hit the mark in the centre, but they themselves, they have such humility, and they see themselves in the sense of, I'm worthless, but I'm loved. And I think when you are a perfectionist, it's, I'm unlovable and I must prove myself. That's the way that you operate. And I think that's such an insult to God. Like, He has truly given His Son for us and for our salvation, really not asking for anything in return other than our hearts. And in response to kind of like, I think I'll do it myself. Like, it's so nonsensical when you take steps back and you acknowledge that. And I'd say that that's one of the demons in my life, is definitely my perfectionism. And that story of Saint Theseus and of that monk gives me a modern perspective, because I've come to learn in the last few years that the struggle is enough a lot of the time. Maybe God wants me to conquer my perfectionism, and that's why He's allowing me to struggle. Maybe for somebody else, especially someone like Saint Marina when you hear her life, maybe she never struggled with the need to be perfect. And as a result, that wasn't, her struggle was a lot firmer and purer and more difficult perhaps. But it wasn't, I don't know, perfectionism is such a sad and long and drawn out and silly struggle when you really think about it. She had total faith in God, and I think when you have that faith, it doesn't matter if you're struggling, because the faith keeps saving you, and the faith keeps lifting you back up into your feet. So I think, that particular story is one I always come back to. I think it gives me great hope that perhaps the reason God allows those particular things in our lives, for us to experience those particular temptations or demons or frustrations or shortcomings, is so that we can overcome the greatest of pride. Makes sense? You can shout.
Maybe the problem is we make a mistake trying to reform ourselves, right? It's possible to have too much approach that flavor. But we need to focus on Christ will give us. So, unity,
Yes.
something like that.
That's vigilance.
That's Christ, the healer. But if you focus on him, right, then he's going to make those changes that are necessary to, not because salvation changes, but he will change us and he'll give us that peace. Because we're sort of focusing on ourselves all the time, in the sense that we are our own saviors, which denies Christ. And hence that's why he allows it to go on the same sins over and over again. We focus only on them and we give glory only to them. And that we really do begin to change.
Yeah, you're on the money. I totally agree. I don't really have much to add to that other than that if we are so preoccupied with not sinning, you're spending all your time thinking about sinning. And it would be more beneficial for you to preoccupy yourself with Christ, because He will, just by doing so, naturally shape and change our hearts. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Any questions or we have any points?
I was more back to the point that Eleni was making before, that story with the monk and St. Basil's. I think what I take from that is it was more his obedience to his spiritual father, and his spiritual father, knowing him, knowing his struggle, knowing his limits and his strengths, was able to give him the advice that was right for him. And through that obedience, and for us in our own lives, our obedience to our spiritual father, who is providing us with the medicine that we need, that's a way that we're working towards our ultimate goal in seeking salvation. So yes, to us it doesn't, or to the other monks it didn't seem like perfection, but it was, because he was perfectly obedient to his spiritual father.
Yes, I love that. That was perfect. Again, don't have much to add to that. I totally agree that his obedience is really, it wasn't perfected in his struggle, and that virtue coming out from that experience is probably what found him, or allowed the angels to come and take him. It's a beautiful thought. And I think again, it's why when we talk about naming our demons, it has to be in the context of confession. It has to be in the context of a spiritual father who knows us and who knows what's good for us. Sometimes you might, if there's someone who has a trusted spiritual father and they know you well, they might give you advice or suggestions that you think, what are you talking about? It's not tough enough. Like I need something to really fix me up. Like what you're saying is too lenient. But often that's exactly what we need. And again, it's the devil looking for ways for you to feel punished. As Christians, you should never feel punished. That's not true what God gives you coming out of confession. You come out of confession feeling unburdened, and the medicine that you're taking, maybe if you took that higher dose of medicine, it would kill you. Maybe you need to take it at a smaller dose. Maybe you can't handle something that is big. I need a greater sort of spiritual medicine to conquer this sin. You have to trust your spiritual father's guidance, because we ourselves rarely know what's best for us. That's certainly the case when we reflect back over our lives and think, I'm really glad God allowed me to dodge that bullet, because I would have ruined. So yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, and to add that to what I said. I agree. Obedience to his spiritual father is central. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Yes, we did.
It's not a question, just
I thought.
I think a lot of causes to be all the holy. And I think there's a huge distinction between perfection as being perfect rather than holiness. And what I think gives us is strength that we can become holy because our Lord, who is God, full of human flesh, and perfected this human nature that we have. Therefore, that gives us that strength to struggle every day. And whilst we're made for, we have that hope in our Lord that we can become holy because He is holy. That is all.
I love that. Holiness over perfection every day. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic distinction, and I think that, again, I'm no great authority on the matter, that holiness is what occurs when we surrender our struggle to God. Perfection, or attempt to gain perfection, is what happens when we ourselves think we can do it on our own. And we know that no human being is perfect other than Christ. So it's foolish for us to think or to strive. Oftentimes we don't think, as Christians, in the sense we don't think, I am going to be perfect. We just find ourselves doing these things without any awareness. Again, which is why emphasis on mindfulness or vigilance of ourselves is so important, because when you observe those things and you can name those things in yourself and identify them, that's what allows you to give them over to God. Otherwise, we're just controlled and it's mindless. And it's you just pray that God will illuminate us on the things that we can never strong enough to change or give to Him. Because a few times they're like all spots in the back of our head and we can't even see them. But yeah, I totally agree that any day holiness over perfection. Christ brings us holiness. Shall we leave it there?
Your Grace, did you want to add anything? Thank you, Vanessa, for sharing with us insights into Saint Marina's life and the implications of the life for our spiritual life. Saint Marina being one of the patron saints of the CYC, your main one. And thank you for attending this evening. Before you go, we want you to go home with a bit of a gift. We here at St George have produced a fasting and feasting calendar, colour-coded, for the whole year of 2020 before COVID interrupted us being able to hand it out to everyone. So despite being July half late, there's still a few months to go in the year. I'm sure this will be very helpful for you and practical. It's got a nice fridge name in it as well, right on the fridge. So take one with you and share it with your friends if you want any more copies. There is pizza on exit and some drinks. So please join us in having something to eat. Were there any other announcements? Can we finish it? What's on Thursday?
Now that you know about Saint Marina, on Thursday, the CYC is holding a lessons for Saint Marina in English, so that all the young people here will have no excuse not to attend. And I can't read German signs. My understanding is that it's His Eminence who will be officiating the service, which is very exciting. It will be taking place at 7 p.m. at St. Spiridon. However, you must register in order to attend. My understanding is that we will be capping the number of people, so register by tonight. Hop online, go to cycnewsouthwales.org.au or our Facebook, and we'll be very excited to see you there.
Let's finish with prayer. Beautiful.